The old rancher almost stepped on the grave before he realized it was there. The summer of 1878 had baked the land along the Cimarron River into hard, yellow earth. Even the wind felt tired. Orson Wycliffe was leading a small herd of cattle toward the water when something strange happened. The cattle refused to go any farther. They crowded together, snorting nervously. Several backed away from the riverbank. One old cow let out a low, uneasy sound that Orson had learned to respect years ago. Animals noticed death long before people did. Orson adjusted the yellow bandana around his neck and guided his horse forward. At 48, he moved slower than he once had, but there were things his eyes still caught better than most men. A riderless horse stood beneath a cottonwood tree. Its reins were stained with dried blood. That was enough to make him dismount. He followed the tracks through the grass until he found a patch of freshly turned earth near the river. A grave. Someone had buried a body in a hurry. A rough wooden marker had been driven into the ground, but the name had been scraped away so violently that deep scars still cut across the wood. Orson stared at it for several seconds. A man could die for many reasons in New Mexico territory, but only certain kinds of people tried to erase the dead. He crouched beside the marker and brushed dirt from the surface. Beneath the gouges, he thought he saw the faint remains of carved letters. Then he heard movement behind him. A figure stumbled from behind a cluster of rocks. A young Apache woman. She looked exhausted. Her clothes were dusty. One sleeve was torn. Fear filled her eyes before she nearly collapsed onto the ground. Without thinking, Orson reached forward and caught her before she fell. The moment his arms closed around her, she panicked. She twisted violently and tried to pull away. Then she spoke in a trembling voice that stopped him cold.
"Please, don't hold me like that."
Orson released her immediately. He had helped frightened people before. This was different. That was not the reaction of someone afraid of dying. It was the reaction of someone who remembered exactly how it felt to be hunted. What had happened to this young woman, and why was someone trying to erase a dead man's name from the world? For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The young woman stood there breathing hard, keeping a careful distance between herself and Orson. She looked like someone who had spent days looking over her shoulder, maybe longer. Orson picked up his hat, brushed the dust from it, and settled it back on his head. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said quietly. The woman steadied him before finally giving a small nod. Her name was Tala Moon Reed. When her eyes drifted toward the grave, the fear on her face changed into something heavier, grief. She told Orson she believed the man buried there was her older brother, Tovan Moon Reed. According to her, Tovan worked as a translator and messenger, a man trusted by both settlers and Apache families, a man who knew how to read documents that most people ignored. A few weeks earlier, Tovan had discovered papers connected to a wealthy landowner named Bram Cawthorn. The papers supposedly proved that land records and water rights near Mora Valley had been altered. Then Tovan disappeared. Not long after that, men started hunting Tala. The story sounded possible. It also sounded dangerous. Orson had lived long enough to know those were often the same thing. Tala claimed a bounty hunter named Grigg Varnell had captured Tovan. She believed Grigg was working for someone richer and more powerful than himself. According to her, they planned to blame Tovan's death on her. Orson listened without interrupting. He had heard desperate stories before. Some had been true, some had been lies. Most were a little of both. When she finished talking, he walked over to the riderless horse standing near the cottonwood tree. A weathered saddlebag still hung from the saddle. Inside, he found a folded poster. He opened it carefully. A reward notice. Tala Moon Reed, wanted for murder. The victim named on the poster was Tovan Moon Reed. Tala frowned. They spelled his name wrong. Orson looked at her. "The man who wrote that poster never knew my brother," she said. Orson looked back toward the grave. Something bothered him immediately. Not the accusation. The date. He read it again, then a third time. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. Nearby, attached to a supply crate abandoned near the riverbank, was a faded shipping tag from a trading post. The crate had been addressed to Tovan Moonreed in thick black ink. The date on the tag was 1 day later than the date listed on the poster, which meant something impossible. If the tag was real, Tovan had still been alive after the poster claimed he was already dead. Orson slowly lowered the paper, because suddenly he was no longer asking whether Tala was lying. He was asking who had printed a murder poster before the murder happened. For a long moment, Orson said nothing. He stood beside the river, holding the poster in one hand and staring at the date printed across the bottom. The paper felt heavier now, not because of what it said, because of what it proved. Many years earlier, before he became a rancher, Orson had trusted a piece of paper just like this one. Back then, he had been younger, faster, and far more certain of himself. A man had been accused of a crime. Witnesses pointed fingers, officials stamped documents. Everything looked official. The man ended up dead. Months later, the truth surfaced. The wrong man had paid the price. Orson rarely spoke about that memory, but he carried it everywhere. Now he looked at Tala and felt that old weight settling onto his shoulders again. Maybe she was lying. Maybe she was telling the truth. But one thing was already clear. Somebody had created this story before the facts existed. That was enough to make him cautious. It was also enough to make him curious. The afternoon heat continued to press down on the valley. Orson finally motioned toward his horse. "Come on," he said. "Where are we going?" Tala asked. "Someplace with shade." That answer earned the smallest smile she had shown all day. Neither of them noticed the tracks on the far side of the river. Someone else had already been there. Someone who knew exactly where the grave was. As they started toward his ranch, take a moment to settle back in your chair or enjoy a sip of coffee with us. Where are you listening from today, and what would you have done in Orson's place? If you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and ordinary people doing the right thing, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. About an hour later, the ranch came into view. It was not much to look at. A weathered house, a small barn, a water trough that always seemed to need repairing. Still, it was home. For the first time that day, Orson almost believed they had a little time. He was wrong. Tala sat quietly while Orson cleaned a scrape on her arm and filled a tin cup with water. She drank like someone who had not felt safe in days. That peace lasted less than 10 minutes. The sound of approaching horses rolled across the dry ground. Orson stepped onto the porch and narrowed his eyes. 3 riders, coming fast. The man in front wore a dark coat despite the heat. Even from a distance, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to chasing people who could not fight back. Grigg Varnell. The name came to Orson before the riders even reached the gate, and judging by the rifle across Grigg's saddle and the smile on his face, he had not come all this way to have a friendly conversation. What Grigg said next would force Orson to make a choice that could change the rest of his life. The 3 riders stopped just outside the ranch gate. Dust drifted slowly around their horses while the afternoon sun hung low over the valley. Grigg Varnell looked exactly like the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. He was not especially large, he was not especially handsome, but there was something cold behind his eyes that made a person uncomfortable. The kind of man who smiled without warmth. The kind of man who enjoyed watching fear do his work for him. Grigg swung down from his saddle and pushed open the gate without asking permission. Orson remained on the porch. Tala stood quietly inside the doorway behind him. Grigg pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Even before he opened it, Orson knew what it was. The same poster. The same lie. "Afternoon," Grigg said. "Been looking for somebody." Orson shrugged. "A lot of people looking for somebody." One of the men behind Grigg laughed. Grigg did not. His eyes moved toward the house, then toward Tala, then back to Orson. "She's wanted for murder." Orson said nothing. Grigg unfolded the poster and held it up. The reward amount was large enough to make most men stop asking questions, large enough to make neighbors betray neighbors, large enough to make poor men convince themselves they were helping justice. Law says she comes with me. Orson studied the paper. Then he looked at Grigg. Funny thing about that poster. For the first time, Grigg's smile faded slightly. What's funny about it? Orson rubbed his beard. The date. A brief silence followed. Only a second, but it was enough. Enough for Orson to notice. Enough for Tala to notice. Grigg recovered quickly. Men like him always did. He stepped forward. Careful, old man. Orson almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, because every bully eventually says the same thing. They all mistake patience for weakness. Grigg finally turned toward Tala. Come here. Tala froze. She did not move. Grigg walked directly to her. Before Orson could react, the bounty hunter reached out and grabbed her from behind. The moment his arm locked around her shoulders, her entire body tensed. Fear flashed across her face, the same fear Orson had seen beside the grave. Then she whispered the words that instantly changed everything. Don't hold me like that. And for the second time that day, Orson realized this was no longer about a poster, a bounty, or even a dead man in an unmarked grave. Because what happened next would decide whether he stood aside like he once had years ago, or finally chose a different path. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Orson stepped off the porch. Not fast, not angry, just certain. Grigg still had his arm locked around Tala when Orson's fist crashed into his face. The impact sent the bounty hunter stumbling backward into the dirt. One of the gunmen rushed forward, the other reached for his revolver. Suddenly, the quiet ranch yard exploded into chaos. Orson was older than every man there. He knew it. They knew it. But age had taught him things youth never could. He grabbed a leather rein hanging from a fence post and snapped it across one man's wrist. The revolver fell into the dust. Another attacker charged him near the water trough. The younger man was quicker. Orson was heavier. The collision sent both men crashing into the trough, splashing water everywhere. By the time the fight ended, 2 gunmen were bruised and groaning in the dirt. Grigg staggered back to his horse. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth. His eyes burned with humiliation. Men like Grigg could tolerate pain. What they hated was being embarrassed. You just made a mistake you'll regret, he growled. Then he rode away with his surviving men. Orson watched the dust settle behind them. A younger man might have celebrated. Orson knew better. The ranch became quiet again, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes before a storm. That evening, Orson and Tala returned to the grave beside the Cimarron River. Under the glow of a lantern, they finished what they had started. The body buried beneath the earth was Tovan Moonreed. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Tala knelt beside the grave and brushed dirt from her brother's coat with trembling fingers. The years had taught Orson that grief often arrived quietly, not with shouting, not with tears, just silence. The lantern light flickered across the grave while the river moved slowly behind them. Tala finally swallowed and nodded. He found something worth dying for. Orson looked down at the body. No, he said softly. He found something worth protecting. Inside his clothing, carefully hidden in a small metal tube, they found the documents he had died protecting. Land records, signatures, proof that powerful men had been stealing water rights and rewriting ownership records for years. Proof that Tala had been telling the truth. Orson sat back on his heels and looked at the papers. The dead man had finally spoken. Before dawn, they carried the evidence to a traveling judge passing through the territory. It took most of the following day before the judge reviewed the papers, questioned Tala, and sent a man to look at the grave. By sundown, the false warrant against Tala was suspended. Questions began spreading through the region. For the first time, people started looking at Grigg Varnell instead of listening to him. Tovan received a proper grave marker with his name carved clearly into the wood. Nobody would erase him again. A few days later, life at the ranch almost felt normal. Almost. One morning, Orson rode into town for nails and supplies. While waiting outside the general store, he noticed a fresh poster nailed to a bulletin board. The paper was new, the ink was dark, and the face staring back at him was his own. Wanted for assaulting a lawful bounty hunter and aiding a fugitive. The paper looked strangely familiar. It was the same type of paper used for Tala's poster. Even the lettering looked familiar, like it had come from the same desk. Orson stared at the poster for several seconds. Then he quietly adjusted his yellow bandana and lowered the brim of his silver belly hat, because Greg Varnell had lost. But the man behind Greg had not. Somewhere beyond the valley, Bram Cawthorne still had money, influence, and friends in powerful places. And now, for the first time, Orson Wycliffe understood something troubling. He was no longer protecting a hunted woman. He had become the hunted man. That grave by the river stuck with me. Not because Tovan Moonreed ended up dead. The West has buried more good men than I can count. What stuck with me was that somebody tried to scrape his name off the marker and bury the truth right alongside him. And all of it started with paper. Folks like to imagine the Old West was ruled by six-shooters and gunsmoke. Sometimes it was. But some of the meanest thieves who ever walked this country never robbed a bank and never drew a pistol. They sat behind desks. They hired lawyers, they filed paperwork, they smiled for photographs. After the United States took control of New Mexico, plenty of ordinary people found themselves trapped in a legal system they didn't understand. Meanwhile, slick lawyers, land speculators, and political operators figured out how to turn confusion into property and paperwork into profit. That's what this story reminded me of. Tovan got killed over paper. Tala got hunted by paper. And Bram Cawthorne tried to hide behind paper. I've seen enough to know a gunfighter can steal your horse. A crooked man with a courthouse behind him can steal your ranch, your water, your family's future, and then convince the newspaper you never owned any of it in the first place. That's a different breed of thief. Meaner, too. At least the outlaw wearing a gun admits what he is. The dangerous ones are the bastards wearing clean collars, talking about law and order while they're picking a grave clean. A lot of folks trust a stamp, a signature, or a government seal. Maybe they're right. But I've learned to trust the dirt over a dead man's bones a little more. Because dirt doesn't lie nearly as often as powerful men do. So let me ask you something. Which scares you more, a thief pointing a revolver at your chest, or one holding a legal document and smiling while he does it?